Not too long ago, every form of music known to man was created using a variety of instruments, and eventually recorded using tape machines and mixed using giant consoles with whack tons of outboard equipment. While these forms of music still exist and thrive today, there's one new element that has changed the workflow forever, and that would be the introduction of the computer, and a piece of software called Pro Tools. When computers became capable of recording high enough quality audio that the human ear couldn't distinguish the difference between digital and analog, the recording industry set aside their tape machines and purchased computers. But there's something else about it that changed the music industry, and that was the fact that any old Joe Schmo could now have a full recording studio in his bedroom without needing to spend the hundreds of thousands of dollars for the commercial equipment used in professional studios. The uses for this, however, didn't exactly gravitate towards recording garage bands on a budget as much as people would have thought. People started using Pro Tools and other programs as an instrument rather than the means of recording one. Though this was a small minority in the 90s, fast forward to the late 2000s and electronic music is booming with popularity. Nowadays, Logic Pro, Reason, and Ableton Live run the show for electronic musicians, where Pro Tools remains in the commercial studios. This movement, though, hasn't come without resistance. It's the popular opinion of many people, mainly older people who don't quite understand and younger people who aren't as mature, that computers have made it far too easy for people to create something great.
Mr. Computer Musician could knock up a song in 10 minutes.
The common argument is these types of musicians can sit in their rooms for an hour doing nothing but pushing buttons and crank out the next big hit on iTunes in minutes. The problem is that the people saying this have no proof and no experience in creating this sort of music, and therefore have no right to make claims about it. They see someone pushing buttons and otherwise doing completely random things to create something they know nothing about, where to the producer every little thing makes sense, even if the words sidechain compression or low frequency oscillator mean absolutely nothing to anybody else. To help you understand, let's summarize what's actually going on in the complex looking programs used by these producers. Each DAW, or Digital Audio Workstation, aka music making program, contains a timeline which takes up most of the space on the screen. On the timeline, you'll find lanes, otherwise known as tracks, each one dedicated to a single sound heard in the song. There are two main types of tracks. First is an audio track, which you will find just simply audio files. These can include sound effects, drum hits, and loops. The other main type of track is called a MIDI track, or sometimes an instrument track. These are generally the tracks used to make the main sounds you hear in an electronic song. Each one contains a virtual instrument, or soft synth. These are basically computer-generated synthesizers which are used to engineer the synth sounds that make up the melodies and harmonies in the song. On the timeline, these tracks contain information known as MIDI, or Musical Instrument Digital Interface. In a nutshell, MIDI is what a producer uses to compose new melodies, harmonies, and chords that will be used in a song. It contains the notes that will be played by the soft synth it's assigned to, as well as info for velocity, sustain, and a very long list of other parameters. Each DAW also contains a mixer view, which provides much more info about the track. In this view, the producer can edit the volume and panning of each track, as well as add effects to the tracks to make them sound different or help them mix well together. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. There's a very long list of effects, each of which have their own uses and theories. Almost every time you click on something, there's a very deep concept behind it, and most of these concepts have existed longer than the computers have, but computers are simply now powerful enough to replicate them. This takes us back to mixing recorded music at a console with lots of outboard gear. The concepts are exactly the same, and the different sorts of effects used do exactly the same. Someone mixing at a console versus someone mixing at a computer have exactly the same things going through their heads. Both people have put a lot of time and effort learning how to make their tracks sound the best, and training their ears to know what to listen for. Mixing, however, is only really a third of electronic music production. There are two other parts to it, and those would be composition and sound design. Composition, while done using different techniques, is otherwise the same as traditional composition using notes on a staff. The notes are represented with boxes of varying length, and velocity is represented by bars below each note, as opposed to different styles of notes combined with dynamic symbols like forte, piano, crescendo, and decrescendo. The interface you see here is known as a piano roll. Some musicians and composers may make the argument that this is more comprehensive than this to support their claims that electronic musicians are less talented, but the piano roll is nothing more than an interface used to compose melodies. And yes, it is much more comprehensive, but it doesn't allow someone who knows nothing about music theory to create good music. While the great classical composers did need to know how to read and write sheet music in order to compose, they would be nowhere without music theory knowledge, which is where the real geniuses have it true. Learning how to read and write is easy, it's what you do with that skill that really matters. The last part of electronic music production is sound design, and this one has so many different concepts behind it would be mad to list them all in a video. Sound design is the creation of different sounds using synthesizers and effects which are then played by the MIDI files composed by the producer. The common argument against this is that producers have no idea what they're doing, they just push random buttons and turn knobs and see what comes of it. Nothing could be farther than the truth. There are more types of synthesis than I could possibly name, but the most common are analog, wavetable, and frequency modulation, or FM. I'll explain analog synthesis because it's the simplest. Each analog synthesizer contains a selection of oscillators. These simply create different types of raw sound waves. These are filters, which filter out frequencies that the producer doesn't want in their sounds. These are called envelopes. These can be assigned to any parameter of the synth and it will change its value over time. For example, an envelope on the master volume has the ability to make the synth fade in slowly when a note is played, or make the sound quickly decay when a note is played, making it more of a plucky sound. These are called LFOs, or low frequency oscillators. Like envelopes, LFOs can be assigned to any of the synth's parameters. Unlike an envelope, however, the LFO will continuously modulate the assigned parameter rather than just modifying it once. Analog synthesizers also generally contain a selection of built-in effects to further modify the sound. The concepts behind this and their applications are something every producer needs to learn in order to create new innovative sounds. Electronic producers therefore have quite a bit on their plate. Everything we just learned about the different parts of production doesn't even begin to scratch the surface. This new way of creating music is here to stay, whether anyone likes it or not. Why is that? Simple answer. While computers haven't made it easier to create music, it's created a more accessible outlet for people. Traditionally, people spend copious amounts of money on their instruments and equipment before they can begin to develop their skills. Creating music electronically provides a method that allows people to start learning without really needing to spend money, thanks to the generous trials offered by programs like FL Studio, Reason, Reaper, and Pro Tools. While some people may have the viewpoint that these types of musicians are talentless, it's not really safe to call it a viewpoint. It's just an assumption made by people who don't know any better and is not to be taken seriously.